I am just totally envious of the organization, having organized conferences, and this is stellar. And I want to say that I'm celebrating this occasion in my natal town. So I am not a California girl. The title of my talk is actually really ambitious, if not a little bit arrogant. And I think everyone in this room has had their own personal encounter with Elephant Psyche and Experience. But I'm hoping that what I talk about today can perhaps, share a little bit of my perspective and my own experience in terms of contributing to the mandate or the goal of really galvanizing change for the elephants. So the title or the subtitle of my talk is Being Who Elephants Need Us to Be. And I just want to take a couple minutes to go back in time and tell you a little bit where that came from. So way back in the Pleistocene, when I was doing my dissertation research, I was taking a transatlantic flight to Copenhagen. And I was seated next to this gentleman, and we were sitting there together, and we kind of smiled. And then the balloons above our heads were sort of like, look, we're stuck here together for 9 hours, and it's only by chance that we're together. And so I'll do my thing, you do your thing, and we'll be fine, okay? So we smiled, put our seatbelts on, went up in the air. The flight attendant came by with the requisite wine and peanuts and things like that, or pretzels. It was SAS, so it was probably something more highfalutin. And so we sat there, and he pulled out his laptop, I pulled out my laptop, and we sat there, and I kind of pulled my eyes surreptitiously, to see what he was doing. And after a few minutes, obviously he was doing the same, because he said to me, can I ask you a question? I was sort of intrigued by this odd juxtaposition of terms, on your laptop, and that was elephants and psychological trauma and PTSD. And he said, I ask because I'm a psychiatrist, and the majority of my clients, my patients, are genocide survivors and political prisoners. So I was very curious, because this is really my field, but elephants. So, of course, he did one of the most dangerous things you could do, right, is ask someone about their dissertation research. And he was particularly vulnerable, right, since he was on a window seat and I was on the aisle. So, of course, I was thrilled, right? Thank you. I'm glad you asked. So I started to tell him the story, which, is now become very famous, of these young male elephants, bulls, in South Africa. In the 1990s, over a decade, were found out to be the very surprising, unprecedented perpetrators, and I use that term on purpose, of killing and sexually assaulting 100 black and white rhinoceroses. And so this was really astounding. And when I was on my first trip to Africa, I found out. I was supposed to be there with the National Science Foundation looking at lions who were also suffering from this massive translocation project that South Africa had engineered. But this was like a huge deal. And so anyways, what they did is they brought in some expert elephant researchers and biologists. And of course, the first thing that they noticed was, well, these teenagers, these males, were not living the normative life that they might otherwise. In other words, in the second phase, as you know, that there's a first phase, where they're born into the family, the natal family, they spent time with their moms and aunties and sibs and cousins, etc. And then they're either, leave sort of forcibly or, leave and join the all-bull group or area. So there's a second phase of socialization, of culturalization, we can think about it, which is very similar, very much parallel to a lot of traditional indigenous people. There's rituals, spending time, and so that's a formative period of time. And these individuals did not have that. In other words, from their point of view, the bulls lack the structure, the normative structure, social structure that they would normally experience. So what they did is they said, we're going to bring in older males. And they brought in translocated older males to the park, and it worked. The young males stopped their premature the sexual period, and they stopped the quote-unquote violence, the attacks, etc. But it was only a temporary fix. And after a while, the same kinds of symptoms appeared. So unfortunately, with not a lot of tolerance for these kinds of things, the young males were shot and killed. So when I was doing my dissertation research, which started a few years ago, I was studying Jungian psychology. Jung was Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist. The psychiatrist sitting next to me happened to be a Swiss psychiatrist. And so that's what I was doing, and I was sort of beginning to look into the sciences in terms of the brain, the study of the brain and mind. So I revisited the elephants, which had really stuck in my mind. Of course, that first trip to South Africa was more than sticking in my mind. It was a profound turning. You know, everyone here has shared some profound turnings. Again, I could wax on and get into sort of personal psychotherapy about it, but the point is that being there and being faced with these individuals put me on a collision course of a life that I lived internally, you know, which I call transspecies. You know, I was running around with my family, rabbits and tortoises and parrot, and then my quote-unquote professional life. You know, I was a research mathematician, and I was doing NSF stuff and blah 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 blah, and I was basically in one sense a hypocrite. So when I was faced with seeing these individuals, you know, right up looking in their eyes, I had to make a decision, and that was when I ended up, which was again not my intent, but I ended up getting a second degree, and I really, the point of that was to find collective language. Okay, science being collective language. The collective language, the epistemic authority to express what I internally had experienced and what I was hoping would be a medium for communicating the voices of non-humans. So I turned, you know, I was really quite naive, that's another nice word for it. I looked through the lens of neuropsychology. So let me just take a minute here and talk about that. Now, this is a picture of Alice in Wonderland, Alice Through the Looking Glass. And so we can think of the sort of conventional approaches to studying wildlife, studying animals in the quote-unquote wild, as Alice looking through the looking glass. And the other perspective is, say, neuropsychology. I mean, there's many. I'm just comparing these two here within the conventional science framework. Is actually more being in the looking glass world. So it's kind of like an inside-out view. So there's a kind of a contrast. And so we can think of an ecological or an animal behavior approach in a different metaphor. And that's like looking at a snapshot. So we see this gentleman here in a tennis outfit, and he's curled up. We can sort of divine some of these things, you know, that maybe he's sleeping, maybe he's in pain, maybe he's reading a comic book. So essentially, like typically, the typical approach to looking at non-humans is like this kind of snapshot. Now, in contrast to, say, like a neuropsychological, or I would also say from a spiritual consciousness, there's many, many. This is just within the very, very limited framework of the epistemic authority of science. So the neuroscience then, or the neuropsychology then, is really more like a video. Okay, so ethology, animal behavior, conventional approaches are more like snapshots, or if I date myself, Polaroids. And this neuropsychological, again, conventional, very limited, but is more like a video. So again, we look at this gentleman here, but then we go back in time and space and see the causality, or see the kinds of experiences that this individual might have had. And again, within the conventional bounds, it's really trying to sort of understand the world, to see the world from the perspective, in this case, of an elephant. What is an elephant's or a specific individual's experience of the world? So I proceeded to tell him about the young bulls. And when you look back in their autobiography or their biographies, all of them had experienced multiple profound psychological trauma, what we call psychological trauma, psychophysiological, mind and body are the one. So they first witnessed this horrific barrage of bullets, you know, totally unreal, totally out of the elephant experience prior to colonization. So that was the first thing. And I just want to make a coda here. When I first started writing these things and being interviewed and stuff like that, I would get copious letters. The majority of the people who have written me, the majority of people who have, I feel to a certain extent, really been galvanized by this, were either prisoners in prison, or they were veterans, or they were recipients of domestic violence. So people who had technically PTSD, CPTSD. So there was that. And then they witnessed their mother killed. They witnessed their mother. And, you know, of course, this is incredible confusion, totally whatever. And then after that, a series more. They were grabbed. You can see the eye of this beautiful baby. This is from Ian and Aurea Douglas Hamilton from the 80s, a cult. And these were the individuals that were, you know, exported to South Africa. And so they experienced this incredible shift. They were taken to places that they were totally foreign. And I think this is an important point of the sort of, again, I'm just coming from a classical perspective of really understanding the importance of place. So it's not just mom and cousin and aunties and everything like that. It's the body, the forms that we, you know, Dina and Carol are talking about, is the tip of the iceberg, because they're rooted, you know, very much like traditional tribal people have expressed that. In fact, there's a fellow named Hustaocha, who is a Quechua, and he says Ailu is the community. He said, I am not from Ailu, I am Ailu. So this notion of translocation, I mean, profound. And they were brought to this foreign place. And so when you think of things from the outside, again, going back to the Allison through the looking glass, that what happens on the outside is translated on the inside. So essentially, you know, when we see these things, these are not just things that happen. They are these soul-changing or soul-assaulting experiences. And this is very much like every elephant. I will make that every elephant, every non-human, every human who has been subjected to these kinds of things, and I would include ourselves. We have many people here. One is Eileen Castell, who's a clinician, who can talk about working with humans, vicarious trauma. So we're in a traumatogenic culture. And so these individuals like Packy and like Billy, when, for example, they do stereotypy, the bobbing, the swaying, various kinds of things. Carol has, you know, many examples from Nepal and elsewhere. These are voices. These are symptoms. These are not just signals like, oh, you know, he's not doing well. These are a soul in anguish. And I know you know all these things, but I guess one of the little small things that I can say is this is totally within the bounds of conventional epistemic authority science, right? The thing that's supposed to be informing. And this is critical, I think, because we can talk with total assurance about at least a kind of a first approximation of non-human experience. So again, the conventional thing, most elephant studies and things like that come from the animal behavior, come from mythology, which because of the tradition, they have excised the brain. Now these things are added on. But meanwhile, in other disciplines, right? So that's in situ studying, like studying them in the wild, et cetera, right? But ex situ, which is all of the animals that are in laboratories, you know, that are in classrooms and things like that, run on the fundamental model of a unitary model of brain, mind, and behavior and consciousness, okay? They got the same brain as we do. And I just took one article here. Non-human animals, non-humans model animals for developmental psychopathology. And the developmental psychopathology is what they do to these individuals in the laboratories, in the classrooms, to create the conditions that we originated with. So it's very important. Again, it's not saying we're the same, but we can function. When I talk to you, you know, we work on the same kind of assumption. I know you're unique, you know I'm unique, but we have a foundation. And it's it's a tip of the iceberg. It's not obviously the whole soul, and it definitely is not the entire elephant as Dina and Carol have described. But it's a little portal, and it's also a leverage point in terms of speaking to people to really convey and quote-unquote give the truth. So that's what I call trans-species psychology, which at the time I was just talking to my defense committee and then my classmates, and I thought it would just, you know, it's a convenience saying nature has a face. And we can talk about Jung psychology with elephants and birds and, you know, amoeba and everyone with that same kind of assurance. And I thought it would disappear, but there's a lot of resistance into saying what Carol and Dina have said, there's nothing between us. You know, we're living in we've created an artificial reality, and it's artificial. Nature is the reality. So this other concept is bidirectional inference. Kind of sounds fancy. It means what I know about the mouse and the mouse knows about me is symmetric. And the same with the ape, the same with the chimpanzee. And this is my dog Pierre and myself. So what I can make inferences. I can draw things like I do with you. I may be incorrect. We've got to be careful of our projections, right? I mean, I do that all the time. Oh, you must be blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, you're totally wrong. But the point is that's where the contemplative practices come in. You know, self-reflection, self-examination. I mean, you know, not to turn into Woody Allen or anything, but the thing is that to hone our skills. And when we meet people like Carol and Dina and many of you out here who have worked intimately, that's what they do. And so there's a real push. I'm telling you the conventional thing. And science is great as a tool. But basically, it's like nail polish remover, right? We want to use it to basically erase all of these layers of social conditioning that are genetic. They've gotten into being genetic. Epigenetics, blah, blah, blah. So that's really what's it about. So back to the psychiatrist. So he's listening to me, and I'm gulping wine, you know, and everything like that. And he goes, that's really amazing. And he said, but what are you doing? You know, what are you doing to help these individuals? And I just tried to rattle off. He said, we have to ban hunting. You know, you have to expand their habitat. And, you know, you have to stop captive breeding, stop captive practices, and release them all to sanctuary. And he's nodding, and he said, but you're forgetting a really important thing. What you're doing really is great, but you're basically retaining the old paradigm. We're helping the elephants here, the humans are doing that, which is all great. But he said, you are forgetting sort of the prime directive of a healer. And that is meeting the individual where they're at. You know, that's a very important thing. When you talk to a good therapist, good clinician, good friend, it doesn't matter who it is, it's not your stuff. You meet that person where they are. There is nothing between you. You are there for them. And that means, this is Charlie Russell. I don't know if you know him or not. We're writing a book together, and I mean, basically, I'm the amanuensis. This is Charlie with his beloved bear, Biscuit, in Kamchatka. He was very much like Daphne. He raised 10 orphaned brown bear, grizzly bears in Kamchatka, and they became bears, which is like what Daphne has accomplished. So that means, like, meeting at they are, we have to step down from our privilege of being human, stop seeing ourselves as being human, and meet them, stand in their paws, stand in their toes, in their feet. This is Jill Robinson, wonderful Jill Robinson of Animals Asia, with holding the foot of a bile bear. And it means to meet them physically, even if there's a differential, which there is here. You see there's a differential there, but we meet together, we meet. This is Gloria Grow and Billy Joe, the Fauna Foundation in Montreal, outside Montreal. It means to meet them emotionally. Be there, right there. This is Diane Fossey. It means really, you know, Carol mentioned about immersing in the culture, immersing, shedding what holds us apart, and listening in and really hearing what the values are and what the culture is of these individuals. And we're very fortunate to have exemplars of elephant healers, Carol, and of course Daphne, and I will add to Courtney, is to say that, you know, my talk is dedicated to Daphne. And I have to tell you that I am very, very fortunate to have met people like Carol and Daphne, Ray Ryan, and others who have worked intimately with elephants. I have not. And I will say that I think that enabled me to do the work. I've been with other non-humans in a very intimate way, and the pain and the suffering was so overwhelming. So I profited from a little bit of a distance. It didn't last long, but at least for the time being, it worked in order to do this work in trauma and trauma recovery. It's very intimate to be exploring, having that kind of audacity to enter in or think one is in another psyche. So again, Carol read the Code of Ethics, and I'm just kind of echoing things here. I just talked to some people, some colleagues and friends, and what inspires you about elephants? It's sort of like I want to be who my dog thinks I am. I want to be who the elephant really thinks I should be, And who are they? They're present, right? I mean, these are all these wonderful things. Honesty and truth, right? Just there. Putting others before oneself. In a real, genuine way. Respect for all nature, and I'm going to bring that in. I think elephants have been remarkable. They've been remarkable for me. They have made me do things I would never do. Really, I mean it. And even coming to a conference is a big deal. Leaving my sanctuary and the rabbits and the tortoises because I feel so responsible for them. And so I have to say there's something very, very powerful, just by purely my own evidence, And yet we have to keep reminding ourselves that the rabbit, the rat, is no different. The parrot is no different than the elephants. And to respect. And there's something so profound. And like carnivores, lions and pumas and orcas and sharks, white sharks, they all have that respect for nature. They have a respect, they have a code of ethics. Equanimity, restraint, all these things, and choosing empathy and love over conflict and violence and distance. So this is just one slide here. This has really been, and it was an unexpected sort of outcome, and that was some of us are starting a new sanctuary. It wasn't something that I thought of. It came together in a synergistic way as a response. And we're calling it the All Bull Elephant Sanctuary Center for Nonviolence. And so all of what I've been talking about is really trying to be embodied in this effort. It's all bull, meaning, generally speaking, male elephants in circuses and zoos have a harder time finding sanctuary. And so that's our response. It also has the tie-in to the young bulls, and that's kind of my homage to these young bulls that I was not able to really help. We will take a female if there's no sanctuary, there's no discrimination there. The elephants in the possessive sense is because they're in charge. They are the ones that direct things. They are telling us what and how to do things. And that's very, very important. We serve them. And then Center for Nonviolence is this thing about deconstructing the catalyst, the transformation, the interpersonal transformation of every human being, as well as our culture. How we do things. Deprivileging the human-human bond. That's a big one. It's a valuable one. It needs to be seen as the strength, as a wellspring for us as we are gathered here. But it also means deprivileging it. Okay? So one's relationship with your canine, with your elephant, quote-unquote, parrot, that's, quote-unquote, as important and needs to have as much priority, more priority in that sense. And that's kind of the trans-species message. So anyways, thank you very much.